Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Just Another Esports podcast. Once again, joined by me, your host, Nicholas Shady Bacon, and my co host, Mr. Kevin Hewbris. This past weekend, we had the first week of stage one kind of group play. Since at the end of this 4 week period, the teams, based on their performance in this quote unquote group stage throughout those 4 weeks, will be placed into a bracket for the first major. So we had that wrapping up. We've already had, I believe, 2 weeks of matches for the Challengers Elite Series. So we'll briefly kind of touch on the standings and the rosters over there. But before we kind of jump into this episode, there was something that just popped up on the Twitter feed that kind of I found extremely ironic slash hypocritical and peeved me a little bit. Not that it was Temp that tweeted this out. I have a lot of respect for Temp, and uh, he wasn't one of the players that I kind of had issues with saying certain things along these lines last season, but pretty much there was some amateur player or someone in the community saying that it doesn't matter how good they are, they're not going to be able to compete against the players that are competing from Texas with their internet and fiber there when he's over in Bay Area with his AT&T Wi-Fi, quote unquote. And Temp pretty much said, if you have this mindset, you should just give up, which I do agree with. However, it's incredibly hypocritical, especially with JCap in the comments saying Lamau, since the LA Optic, with that roster of Slasher, Kenny, TJ, and JCap, used that excuse quite a lot during the previous CDL season. So that's something to just think about there. JCap, you might want to shut the fuck up, buddy, since you got no room to talk in that scenario. Temp, he's got all the room to talk since he didn't use his internet as an excuse all of the prior season. So, with that out of the way, we'll move on to kind of a brief discussion of the Challengers Elite Series, since we did have 8 teams qualify for NA and 8 teams qualify for Europe. And I think it's important that we kind of briefly touch on the rosters and where they currently stand in the first Challengers Elite Series that we do have, since these are kind of the up and coming players, as well as maybe some of the older players that didn't make it into the pro league this season simply because of uh, the roster shrinkage from 5 to 4. And so over in the NA region, you obviously had Westar qualify. That's that team of Paul X, Zapdius, Gravity, and Venom. As well, you got Built by Gamers. That's that squad of Goddard X, Kismet, Pander, and Pentagrams. The UT crew has a familiar face with Phantoms, and he's teaming with the likes of Rex, Yeez, and Gintroid. You got Subliners Academy, who won that 5th Challengers Cup. Their roster is Prolute, Spart, Saints, and Glowfrosty. Mr. Mid Maps, it's probably one of the lesser known ones, but the players aren't lesser knowns. I think it's kind of just more so the name. They don't really have a sponsor, I guess, for their team yet.
Right.
That's the lineup of Fellow, Decimate, Draza, and Nagafin. You got Maki Mock and the Funky Bunch or something, but that's a lineup of Cells, Jimbo, Sibilance, Hollow. You got HYXR. I'm not like Hyper. I don't know what they're trying to
Higher.
spell. That does not spell higher at all. Maybe if they got rid of the
Uh,
X. I think they're just really bad at English pronunciation, and so they're HYXR. Sorry. That's the lineup of Mayhem, Exotic, Proto, and Zinx. And then you got Team Z, super original name for that squad. That's obviously going to have Zed on it, along the side of Dens, Jerd, and Tay. And I think the interesting about this Team Z lineup is the highest or the best placement they got during all the Challengers Cups was a top 64. They did not break into top 32 throughout all the Challengers Cups. However, they were able to make a miracle run through the elite qualifiers and make it into this first Challengers Elite season. Currently, they're actually doing pretty well too. Currently, they're 3-1 in the standings. At the top, both teams with a 4-0 record. You got Westar and Subliners Academy. You have Team Z and UT Crew at 3-1. Built by Gamers and Higher, they're both 1-3. And then Mocky Mock and Mr. Minmaps are both 0-4. And Mr. Minmaps has a very abysmal map win to loss record of 1-12. So they only have an 8% map win record as it currently stands. Westar have had probably a bit of an easier schedule, so to see, as they faced the bottom 4 teams. So one of the matches that will be quite interesting to see is once they finally do face up against Subliners. That is not going to be happening at least on the 16th, but they will be playing on the 17th. So they'll be playing in, I guess, 1 day's time from when this episode is coming out. So that'll definitely be a match to watch up if they both go into that with undefeated win the loss records. But that is the NA side. You see kind of a big difference, I think, from like the top 4 to the bottom 4 with the match win to loss records. But over in Europe, it seems to be a lot more competitive in a sense. A lot of more teams have kind of beaten others and lost to others, as we do have a couple teams here with a 2-2 map record. At the top, though, the top team right now in the European region is Orgless. That is the lineup of Nasty, Josh, Harry, and Vortex. They're 4-0. Right behind them with a 3-1 map record is both Gangsters and Connect. Gangsters is that kind of French lineup, I do believe, with Hydra, Keza, Whalers, and Henry. So you got Hydra still stuck over there in Europe, obviously, but he's competing alongside some of his countrymen, or I guess at least one of them in Whalers. That Connect lineup is their squad is BB. No, that's not it. It's Nolson, Joe, old player that he was the coach last season for the London Royal Ravens, and prior to that he was on Red Reserve. Dave and Linny, that is their lineup. The 2 teams at 2-2 is Rams, that Spanish lineup, which consists of Invidian, Journey, Lucky, and Metals. Obtained Esports, which is the lineup of BB Connor, Callum, Hixie, and Chain. House Tarth and Singularity are both at 1-3. That's a little bit surprising, I think, for maybe a couple people out there that have been watching and paying attention to the EU Challengers Elite Series, simply because Singularity all of last year was, both of these teams actually all of last year were kind of the cream of the crop for the European region. They're both down here at a 1-3 record. The House Tarth lineup is Afro, Defrag, Gizmo, and Weeman. And then on the side of Team Singularity, that's Denza, Bids, Maple, and Detain. And then at the very bottom is Team 3G, which is a lineup of Aroma, Disarray, Genesis, and Nile. So that's probably a roster of less kind of well-known names in the European scene and even, I guess, in the Pro-Am scene. So those are the NA and EU Elite Challengers kind of rosters and kind of where their current standings are. They have 2 more days of matches, I do believe. One being tonight, the 16th, and the 17th of February. And then I'm not sure exactly what happens after the end of that, but those are the current standings. So maybe tune in and check those out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Elite Challengers is a lot more fun to watch than watching like Challengers Cup or whatever, just because those teams actually, it feels like it's worth it. Feels like they're there, for a reason. Anybody can sign up for a Challengers Cup and be like, oh yeah, I'm playing in the Challengers Cup. Who cares? But these guys have actually like proven themselves and won time and time again. So actually, it's pretty good, entertaining COD. And they're basically at the same level as the pros at that point.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot of fun to watch, and I think it means a lot for kind of the teams that do qualify since it's a little bit more structured. You do have kind of like the regular season matches, and the way it works, I believe, after all the matches are played, is it's split up into kind of a relegation point where the bottom two teams will get sent out of the Elite Series, and I think uh, the rest automatically requalify. I'm not too certain on that, but I know the rest kind of move on into a playoffs bracket where there's obviously prize money on the line. So you definitely don't want to be the bottom two in the Elite Series. So you can kind of ensure your position there and kind of ensure some guaranteed money uh, while you're competing to try and get into the pro scene. But that's kind of all I really wanted to talk about around there, since I know kind of the main talking point is obviously the first week of matches for the CDL. Once again, Kevin kicked my ass in the predictions. The last two matches are, I guess, kind of all the matches that he got wrong, maybe outside of like the last one. The last one obviously could have gone either way, that Atlanta Chicago one. I think both of us thought it was going to be a little more convincingly in Chicago's favor. However, in spoiler, went to Atlanta. But the other two that Kevin got wrong, the one being the first matchup that we saw between LA and Minnesota, and then the other one that he got wrong was another Minnesota matchup. So Minnesota, they just don't really know kind of if they want to be really good or if they want to be average. Me, on the other hand, I all the matches that we disagreed on, I got wrong, which is incredibly unfortunate for me, and I guess a bit of my ego. So hopefully, I'm gonna do better for this upcoming week, as I see Kevin might have disconnected from our Discord call, unfortunately, due to some power issues. So we'll try and get him back in here. In the meantime, though, I guess continue on with the podcast. So going into the first matchup, it was the LA Thieves up against the Minnesota Rocker. The LA Thieves ended up taking that match against the Minnesota Rocker in a 3-1 fashion. Minnesota took the S&D, as that's kind of going to be a common trait that we're going to see in the Minnesota Rockers matches, is that they're able to pull out these S&Ds. However, they dropped both the hard points and they lost the control. I think something that's going to be very interesting to kind of keep your eye on, as it's something that I noticed for kind of a couple of these series, was the control is going to be very dependent, I think, on whatever team, at least on some of the matches. I think Checkmate specifically is an incredibly defensive heavy map. I don't think we've seen a team win an offensive round on Checkmate control at all. We have seen teams pull out offensive wins on both Garrison and Raid, which are the other two control maps. However, for Checkmate control, it's really heavily defensively favored, and so what we might end up seeing is a lot of these checkmate controls where a team just wants to get the defense so they can guarantee that map 3 win. I can't remember specifically. I'm going to kind of look it up here, what map that the Thieves played on for control. It was a Garrison control that they played up against the Rocker, and they won that 3-1. So I guess good on the Thieves there, that they didn't have to kind of resort to that wonky defensive tactic that's, I guess, a little cheap, I guess one could say. And maybe it's not cheap. Maybe teams just haven't figured out how to kind of really break through offensively for Checkmate. That is something that they have kind of figured out how to do with the Garrison control, which was another one that everyone thought was extremely defensively favored, which it is still relatively defensively favored, but teams have kind of figured out how to pull out those victories there. But the hard point went the ways of 100 Thieves, 250 on Garrison. Rocker got 194. The Miami S&D went to the Rocker. That was 6-4. Garrison Control, as I said, 3-1 for the Thieves. And then the Moscow Hardpoint, the Rocker kind of got slaughtered on that one. They lost that 250 to 60. So the Thieves took the first win in stage one up against the Rocker. That was one both me and Kevin kind of predicted was going to go in favor of Minnesota. I said it was going to be a 3-2, so a little bit closer. I was a little bit unsure of. I was a little bit more cautionary of kind of Minnesota's potential up against this LA Thieves roster, because even though LA Thieves got kind of realistically obliterated by Optic Chicago, I had faith that this roster was going to pick it up for when the kind of the actual season matches came around, and that they did. They took down the Minnesota Rocker 3-1. So congratulations to Slasher and the boys there. They got the job done. The next matchup that we saw, it was the Dallas Empire versus the Seattle Surge, and that was a relatively swift 3-0 in favor of the Dallas Empire. Not really too much to talk about there. I mean, that kind of outcome is really expected against the kind of team that a lot of us see this Seattle lineup as in comparison to Dallas. And unfortunately, I am going to mention that I don't think we're going to be able to get Kevin back in here for the rest of this podcast. So if you only watch this so you can hear Kevin's hot takes and lovely voice. Unfortunately, I don't know if we're going to be able to get him back in here simply due to the snowstorms that pretty much the entire United States is facing at the moment. But hopefully we'll be able to get back in here, but if not, I guess you guys could leave if you don't want to listen to my recap and analysis and predictions for this upcoming week of matches. So, but I'd be more than happy if you did stay and listen. So I'm gonna continue on with the recap of the first week of CDL matches. The first Friday matchup that we saw, it was kind of another one that we didn't really expect too much out of. Well, actually, both of the Friday matchups, honestly, were kind of a little bit boring in that sense that they were both 3-0s. Chicago 3-0'd Paris. Both me and Kevin kind of predicted that it was going to be relatively, well, extremely convincing in Chicago's favor over the Paris Legion. And then the other 3-0 was the Atlanta Phase 3-0'd the LA Guerrillas. Both me and Kevin kind of predicted that as well. Those are, I mean, you're looking at Dallas, Chicago, Atlanta as kind of your big three, maybe with the loss to Florida. You were thinking, okay, maybe Florida's in there, maybe it's the top four. And then after the LA Thieves beat Minnesota, maybe like say, so there's a bunch of kind of moving around in people's like power rankings. And one of the things I want to do better is not move teams around too much simply based on the week to week, but more on kind of where they are going to be later down the road. Since I know that was one thing that I feel like I did a good job of at the beginning of kind of this podcast series, but I feel like as it's gone on, I've been a little more wishy-washy on my power rankings, and having the week to week performances kind of influence my opinions a bit more heavily. But I think that's something we're going to kind of see. Uh, I guess I'll save this talking point to when I get to the Dallas and Minnesota matchup that we saw on Sunday. But we're going to move on then to our first Saturday matchup, where we saw the likes of LAG take on the Paris Legion. And this was a very intense matchup between kind of probably the two bottom teams of their group. Went all the way to a game five, the first game five of the CDL season, or the actual CDL season. And the LA Guerrillas ended up taking it in the end over the Paris Legion 3-2. And so for this matchup, if I can get their score sheet up here really quickly, I don't think it was a reverse sweep, but it was very close to it. The LA Guerrillas went up 2-0 against the Paris Legion quite early on, taking the first hard point and the first S&D. And then the Paris Legion were able to bring it back, taking the checkmate control. Wow, it took the checkmate control 3-1. So I say no one's ever won a defense or an offensive round on checkmate control, but that I guess that must have slipped my mind in this Paris Legion Gorillas matchup. That's definitely something to probably go back and watch. I'm assuming it wasn't from, might have been through capping the points, in all honesty. I can't remember. I feel like something along those lines might have happened, but they ended up taking the second hard point, but then the girls' S&D was just a bit too strong, and so they were able to close that 6-4 on the raid game 5. Um, I think there was a relatively large performance from the side of Apathy and Vivid, and when those players weren't going off for the LA Gorillas, they really did seem to kind of struggle in their matches. And so that's kind of going to be a reoccurring factor to look at is if you're not having big performances from Apathy or from Vivid, they're SMG players on the side of Gorillas, they aren't going to win against some of these other teams. And so I think something to look at with kind of prediction wise for if the Gorillas are going to be able to bring out a victory against their opposition is you really have to look up at the SMG matchup. And you kind of have to look at it and be like, okay, is Apathy and Vivid better than this SMG duo? If they are, then yeah, you could probably say the win. If they aren't, then they're most likely not going to come away with the dub. That's kind of how I'm probably going to be looking at this LAG lineup throughout the season. And we'll have to see if it holds true because I think that it's probably a pretty good point. Obviously, if you're saying, okay, well, if the SMG duo, that's literally half the team, is better than the other team, then you're saying 50% of one team is better than 50% of the other team. So yeah, obviously they'll win, but um, there's some proof in the pudding there, I think, with that that analysis. Now, this was a relatively large upset simply based on kind of Florida's performance in the Kickoff Classic, but Toronto was able to pull out the upset. This was one that Kevin got right. He said Toronto was going to take the victory over the Florida Mutineers 3-2. They ended up taking it 3-1 over the Mutineers, who played absolutely. They played very poorly in their respawn game modes, and they even got kind of their favored Crossroads hardpoint, and they still lost to the Ultra on that map. The only thing they were able to take was the garrison control. So that was probably I can't remember exactly. I'm probably going to have to start keeping track of this, but I imagine that might have just been some trading of defenses. But the Ultra kind of gave the business to the Mutineers. They took relatively they took convincing hard points. The Mutineers never crossed the 200 point mark in either of the hard point losses. So I would say that's probably pretty darn comfortable for on the side of Ultra. And the Miami S&D, the Ultra won that 6-4. And that was something else I noticed from kind of this weekend was there was a lot of Miami search and destroy. No matter how much I'm gonna have to talk to Salvation's Elite about this because I know he is not a big fan of Miami at all. I'll have to get his opinion of it for search and destroy. I don't think he was that big of a fan of it for search and destroy, but we've been seeing quite a lot of Miami S&D. At least this past weekend, we'll have to see if that kind of trend continues throughout the weeks because it's a relatively interesting pick. It's a very, very large map, gives teams kind of a lot of space to move around, and you can be spotted from quite a few different angles depending on kind of where you're moving around the map. So um, I honestly, I kind of like it. The bomb positions I think are a little wonky, but overall, I think it's probably a pretty decent S&D map. I just didn't think a lot of the other players would share that same mindset as me in liking that map for search and destroy at the very least. But moving on to the second Saturday matchup that we did see, it was another one, or no, our third Saturday matchup, the one to close it out. It was the LA Thieves versus the New York Subliners. I obviously got this one wrong. I said New York was going to take it 3-2. Kevin said that the LA Thieves were going to take it 3-2 over New York. This was a little more of a shot in the dark. This was realistic. Like you look at kind of the New York roster, and it's very new. They've had a lot less time to work with the players that they have been given due to kind of the tough scenarios that they found themselves in, obviously with Zuma's injury and him needing to recover from that, as well as Hydra still being stuck in Europe. And so realistically, if you kind of looked at this on paper, you're going to be like, yeah, New York will not beat the Thieves. And they didn't. It was a 3-0 in favor of the LA Thieves. However, from this matchup, I honestly felt more confident in New York coming out of it. They were up in the hard point to search and destroy, or they were in scenarios where they could have taken the hard point, the search and destroy, and the control. And in each of these three game modes, honestly, there was a moment where I was like, okay, wow, New York, they're going to be able to beat the Thieves here. And they just weren't able to clutch up in these very specific scenarios that honestly cost them each of those maps every single time. And so I actually feel pretty good about New York coming out of this, even though it was a 3-0, that if they kind of clean up some of these small, extremely visible mistakes, because obviously LA Thieves, they probably made a couple small mistakes here and there, and New York as well, that like, but these are like, those are mistakes that you don't really notice as a casual viewer when the mistakes that, when I was able to like visibly see mistakes that New York was making that physically costed them each of those maps, like then that's like, okay, that's stuff that they will be able to fix quite easily in my eyes. Um, and so I feel pretty good for New York. And honestly, like this series should have gone a lot deeper. It should have at least gone, I think, a game 5 if New York was just able to clutch up in some of the spots they found them in. Unfortunately for my predictions, they did not. And so this win once again goes to Kevin, who's unfortunately not here to gloat about his big brain IQ prediction plays. But that was our last Saturday matchup. Moving into Sunday, we saw the likes of the London Royal Ravens up against the Seattle Surge. I said London was going to take it 3-2 over the Surge. They did not. The one time I bet against the Surge, they actually pull out the victory in a game 5 nonetheless. They won both of the S&Ds, which is crazy to think of when you look at kind of the Seattle Surge roster and how abysmal they were at Surge all of last year. But even with kind of this loss for the London Royal Ravens, I honestly think coming out of this, London is the better team than Seattle. And maybe some of this is a little bit of the honeymoon effect now that London just got in Parasite. Parasite did very well, might I add, throughout the entire series. You could definitely see a lot of his old Black Ops 2 kind of experience come back. He is a world champion in that title, come back and really benefit them in the raid S&D. Like Parasite was popping off in that raid search and destroy, even though they did end up losing it. Outside of like that though, you look at kind of the first hard point, and Seattle destroyed London Royal Ravens in the slaying department. Like it was not even close. I'm pretty sure Gunless went like 40-18 or something just absolutely absurd in that Crossroads hard point. And they only won by like 20 points or something like that. It was not a convincing win. Yeah, the final score on that Crossroads hardpoint was 250 to the Surge, 229 to the London Royal Ravens. So I am incredibly worried about the Surge's hard point. Like, they are not a good hard point team. They lost the checkmate hard point 250 to 115. And if Gunless didn't have as big of a map as he did on that Crossroads hardpoint, they would have gotten wiped off the map. Honestly, London Royal Ravens probably should have won that Crossroads if they just were able to keep up a little bit in the slaying department. And so I am, even though Seattle came away with the W this week in this matchup against the London Royal Ravens, in my eyes, they have so much to work on, and it's honestly an L. Like, in my eyes, they honestly lost to the London Royal Ravens. They had Parasite come in, practice with the roster for like a week or two. Yes, maybe they improved significantly because of that due to like the honeymoon factor and not being as like other teams not being as familiar as playing against them as a result of bringing in that new player to the roster. But Seattle, even though they won, it was not a clean win, and they have a lot to work on. So they should not be happy with this win. They should look at this win as a loss and put their heads to the pavement and just keep on bashing through, like, keep on. They need to, like, do something. I can't find the words, the inspirational words for it, but Seattle's not in a good place right now, even with this win, in my eyes. But moving on to our second matchup, this was the biggest upset, I think, of the weekend. Maybe you could look at that Florida Toronto matchup as maybe potentially a rival biggest upset to this one. But Dallas Empire lose to the Minnesota Rocker 3-2. Minnesota have not lost a search and destroy, and they haven't won a hard point yet. And so some of that might come down to pacing issues with Major Maniac, with accuracy between kind of the players on this roster. Since they clearly have not been doing good in the respawn game modes. Now, they were able to squeak out a control victory up against the Dallas Empire. And the Dallas Empire made a bunch of weird mistakes in the S&D. They played it very like there were some clearly visible mistakes where the Dallas Empire had numbers advantage on Garrison Search and Destroy, and they had kind of the bomb site locked down, and they decided to make aggressive plays when it was the Rocker that had to make an aggressive play to plant the bomb, which that happened visibly one time where you had, I believe it was Shotzi and Hook run out of top green and get gunned by Accuracy, who is still relatively far back on the map, kind of holding a corner. When like it was a 3v2 scenario, and Minnesota needed to go and plant the bomb, but like the Dallas Empire decided to move for some reason instead of just holding down the lanes that they had. So some very weird plays coming out of the Dallas Empire, and the kind of point that I wanted to bring up that I mentioned kind of earlier in the podcast was I think this is where we're going to see teams at their most vulnerable, where we're going to see the most upsets, because all these teams are kind of figuring each other out, especially in S&D. And this is kind of one of the things that maybe you can go to and look at kind of the prior season. Minnesota had an incredible start to this season. They were looking like a top 3 team, top 4 team at the start of last season. However, they fell off an insane amount, all the way down to probably being the 10th or ninth worst team in the league by the end. And a lot of that can probably be contributed to teams just figuring out how they want to play. And so Rocker might just be ahead of the curve with kind of their S&D strats, and they might not be able to adapt throughout the season if teams figure out a way to counter what they want to do in search and destroy, which could be a very glaring issue, especially if they're not able to pull out hardpoint wins, which they haven't been. They're 0-5 in hardpoint. So, or 0 yeah, oh, no, they played, are they 0-6 in hardpoint? I have to, they're 0-5 or 0-6 in hardpoint, which is really not what you want to see. And hardpoint is one of those game modes where you're not going to become an insane hardpoint team overnight. It's a lot harder to kind of prep for hardpoint when you're respawning over and over again. You don't just have these kind of one-off playbook plays where you can just write up a bunch of 50 different plays or whatever and pull them out at any scenario as you can in search and destroy, and teams have to figure out and adapt to that round by round. Whereas like hardpoint, it's continuous motion, and so there's a lot less planned in hardpoint, and it's a lot more of second to second adapting, and so it's something that's a lot harder to become good at than I feel it is in S&D. It's also something that the skill gap is going to be, I think, a lot more apparent in hardpoint than it is, at least gun skill wise, in hardpoint than it is in S&D. And so the Rocker, they definitely have impressed. It seems like a relatively inconsistent lineup right now. At least maybe for them with their loss to 100 Thieves. We'll have to see how Dallas play up against the 100 Thieves. I don't think we're going to be seeing that matchup this weekend. But when that we do get that matchup, it'll be very interesting to see kind of what happens there. Uh, but yeah, this Minnesota lineup, it has great potential, I guess you could say, at least right now, if they're able to kind of do something with their hard point. Since currently it's in an abysmal state right now, their S&D is fantastic, but like teams are at their most vulnerable right now in my eyes. You don't really know what teams are going to be doing in Search and Destroy since that's not something you've been scrimming against other pro teams in your group, so to say. And so this is where we're probably going to see the most upsets, at least in my eyes. Obviously, I would love to get Kevin's opinion on that kind of point, but once again, he's not here. It's so unfortunate. Uh, but the last matchup we had this past weekend, it was Chicago versus Atlanta, and Atlanta was able to pull out the dub here. They won it 3-2 up against Chicago. The hard points were incredibly competitive, very close, nail-biting hard points. I think there was only like a 20-point differential at the end of either of them. Huge play by Abizi on the Moscow hard point to win the rotation for huge three-piece by him to win the rotation for P4 to help Atlanta get the W there. And the control, it was a defensive favored checkmate control that Chicago got defense for. So that was, I guess, a bit of strategy there in the map vetoing, or I'm not exactly sure, kind of who got picks or whatnot um, for the control. But Chicago definitely needs to work on their S&D since they went 1-12, I think, in their search and destroy against the Atlanta FaZe. It was like a 2-12. It was a very poor showing for them in search and destroy. They looked quite lost on Miami search and destroy, and they did not look that much better on the Moscow S&D. And so Chicago's definitely going to need to go back to the lab to look at that one. But any kind of doubts, I guess, we might have had from the Atlanta FaZe roster from their loss to Florida in the Kickoff Classic, I think has since been resolved from this victory over Chicago, even though it was an incredibly close series. Obviously, if Chicago was able to clutch up at the end of that Moscow hardpoint, that game 4, they would have won the series 3-1. But however, some big plays on the side of FaZe brought it all the way to that game 5. So Chicago, they need to look to fix their S&D. Atlanta FaZe is looking solid right now. Dallas maybe just needs Dallas. I think we can also say has some stuff to work on. So a lot of the teams have things to work on, but it's the beginning of the season, and I already kind of touched on my mindset at the beginning of the season. I think we do need to collect a lot more data, kind of see which teams are going to be able to top which teams simply based on kind of the veto process and which teams play better on against certain play styles and whatnot. But that was the recap for week 1 of stage 1. And now we're going to move on to at least my predictions for week 2 of stage 1. Hopefully, maybe I can get Kevin's predictions. Maybe not. If not, we'll just go over I guess, his predictions next week since because we're doing all these stages. I think we're going to try and do an episode a week pretty much. Obviously, we'll align that with the break, the like week break that there is between the end of the group stage, quote unquote, of each stage and the major of each stage. But moving into this week's matches, on Thursday, the first matchup we do have is going to be the Florida Millionaires versus the LA Gorillas. So the LA Gorillas probably seem to be like the most prepared team. They seem kind of like the most cohesive unit as of right now. However, I think the talent on that lineup just cannot compare to the talent on a lot of the other lineups right now. And so for that reason, I'm going to give it to the Florida Mutineers 3-2. The Florida Mutineers played pretty abysmally against the Toronto Ultra in last week's matches. And I mean, the LA Guerrillas, they were able to beat Paris. However, I don't really put Paris all that highly up in my power rankings. But anything can kind of really happen in these early stage matchups. But I'm going to give it to Florida 3-2. Actually, I'm going to say 3-1 over the LA Guerrillas. It will definitely be very interesting to see, but I think realistically, Florida, they 100% should take the respawns here. If they don't, that is where it gets very scary, since I don't tout Florida as an insane search and destroy team. Um, so I think the key here is definitely going to be for Florida to win the respawns, and depending on what control map it is and who gets defense, I guess, if it goes to checkmate, but that's still, I guess, up in the air there. The second matchup is going to be Chicago versus Toronto. Toronto being one of the rosters that Chicago seemed to struggle with quite a lot in the prior seasons. And so this is actually kind of interesting because if this does go to a game five and Chicago has as bad of an S&D performance as they did against the Atlanta FaZe, I'll bet like Atlanta FaZe being probably one of the, if not the best S&D team. At least that's kind of what we were saying last year, except at least early on in the season. Um, yeah, this could definitely be a scary matchup for Chicago up against this Toronto lineup. Uh, but I'm going to give this to Chicago in the end. I think right now you just have to. Uh, we've seen Toronto do well against Florida, but that's realistically the only kind of matchup we've seen out of them in a full-on serious environment. And so I'm gonna go Chicago 3-1 over Toronto. If this does go to a game five, I think Toronto might take it, especially if it goes to a Miami search and destroy, which we don't have too much data right now since we've only had 1 week in matches, but it is going to be interesting to see kind of which teams favor which S&D matches, since that's definitely going to be something to take into account. Our next matchup is Minnesota versus Seattle. I'll be giving this to Minnesota. I'm going to say this is also probably a 3-1 or a 3-2. Either way, I think Minnesota's going to take this in the end. I don't have really any faith in the Seattle lineup as of right now. They won their matchup against Toronto, or up against the London Royal Ravens, excuse me, but they did not play well in their respawns whatsoever. And so this might be where Minnesota Rocker pick up their first respawn victory, their first hardpoint victory. It might be up against the Seattle Surge lineup. So maybe that will give them some boost in confidence. And if Minnesota continues its reign in S&D and starts picking up hardpoint wins, that's the makings of a scary roster right there. But our last matchup on Friday is going to be the London Royal Ravens versus the New York Subliners. I'm going to give this to Subliners 3-2 over the London Royal Ravens. The Ravens looked pretty good with Parasite. I definitely don't think they're a bad team. I don't think New York is a bad team either. Honestly, none of the lineups in here you could say are realistically bad. I would put New York and London on pretty equal footing, I would say. I think I just put a little more faith in a Game 5 search and destroy for the New York Subliners, simply based on kind of what I saw from the likes of them. I mean, London, they lost both S&Ds to the Seattle Surge. Their raid did not look good, at least on the side of Alex and Dylan. I don't think those guys were they, I don't even know. Were they around during Black Ops 2? Did they even play Black Ops 2? Because I think that both of them dropped simultaneous donuts on that S&D map. Meanwhile, Parasite was going off at like 10-3 or something like that. So this might be one that comes down to kind of the maps that are picked. But I do think I liked what I saw from the subliners up against the 100 Thieves this prior weekend. And so I have faith on them to kind of shore up the obvious mistakes that they were making that I was able to see. Obviously, there are probably a bunch of smaller mistakes that they did make that I was not able to see, but big mistakes that I'm vividly able to see and point out, I have faith that this lineup will be able to correct. And starting off, it also might be a bit of a issue since London. Well, it's going to be interesting because the first Saturday matchup is London versus Dallas, so that's definitely going to be a matchup that London is looking intently at, and so they might overlook the New York Subliners too. That's something that you might be it's at least in the back of my mind, kind of looking at that. But I'm going to give this to Dallas 3-1 over London. I cannot see Dallas dropping to any of the teams in their group outside of maybe Thieves since they were able to take down Minnesota. I think Dallas might have just underlooked Minnesota a bit, and so that might have been something that led to their loss there. But another one that I think is going to be pretty convincingly is our second Saturday matchup. Chicago versus the LA Gorillas. I'm going to say 3-1. Could be a 3-0. I think it's quite likely to be a 3-0, but I'll say 3-1 just to be safe. And honestly, Saturday matchups, not too many interesting ones. I guess the highlight one is your Atlanta versus Toronto to kind of round out the Saturday, but even that one, like I'm actually going to say 3-2 for Atlanta in this one. Atlanta lost to Florida. Toronto beat Florida. So if I guess you're going to look at it through the inheritance factor, Toronto is better than Atlanta. However, I don't think that is the case. However, for some reason, like this Toronto roster, I think we said it in maybe one of the prior podcasts, they always play teams close. They always have. And they were able to pull out a W up against this Atlanta FaZe roster at the last kind of home series last year. And they were finally kind of able to clutch up and pull out the W after playing so many teams close throughout the entire season. But right now, I'm going to say Atlanta 3-2 against Toronto. However, Toronto could definitely surprise me here. It's not outside of the realm of possibility. Whereas London and LAG beating Dallas and Chicago respectively, I think that's pretty much outside of the realm of possibility. I don't see that happening. Moving on to the first Sunday matchup, it's going to be Florida versus Paris. I'm going to say it's going to Florida 3-2 up against this Paris Legion lineup. This Paris Legion lineup, it's an interesting one. I mean, Scraps has had a pop-off game. Aqua has had a pop-off game. It's just Classic and Fire who haven't really had any pop-off games. And Fires did better this past week than he did do at the Kickoff Classic. However, I still probably put this Paris Legion lineup at the bottom of my power rankings. I potentially last in my power rankings. They are kind of the scraps of the CDL. No pun intended, obviously, but like, yes, they can come together under that camaraderie of being the leftovers, but leftovers are still leftovers, and so you can do what you want with that. I do stand by the fact that the team that wins the game is not the team with the best player, but the team. But what is the saying? There's a great Haikyuu quote in there somewhere. Oikawa, shout out my guy, but I can't remember it, and I feel so bad. But it's like the stronger team is the one with the stronger four players, or the team that works better. It's something along those lines. Like obviously they can pull off some upsets if they really come together and really make kind of the core group that they have there. But Yeah, I just don't think they're at that point yet where they're working so flawlessly together that they could pull out W's against teams that are individually better than them. I think that's kind of where my mindset is right now with this Paris Legion lineup. Obviously, that can change throughout the season, but right now they're not there yet. Next up on Sunday is the LA Thieves versus the Seattle Surge. Yeah, this is an LA Thieves dub. I think I'm gonna go 3-1 LA Thieves over Seattle. I really do not have a lot of faith in the Seattle Surge lineup. They haven't done anything to impress me. Like outside of Gunless dropping an absolute bomb on the side of the London Royal Ravens, like that's the only impressive slaying performance they've had. And even with that impressive slaying performance, something with their team play or how they were playing the map must have just been absolute dog shit because they only won by 21 points in the end, with a player going nearly double positive. So yeah, not a lot of faith in the Seattle Surge right now, unfortunately. Since I do want them to do well, I'm happy they got a win. I'm happy they got a win with two S&D wins, but yeah, it was not a good win. And so to close out the night, close out week 2 on Sunday, we got the Minnesota Rocker versus the New York Subliners. And I'm definitely going to have to give this one to Rocker. New York, they're still kind of working on some things, as so is kind of London. And so obviously, I said earlier on New York was going to take that dub against London. That one's going to be a very kind of iffy one. But this one I think is a little more clean cut in favor of the Minnesota Rocker. Potentially question mark. I mean, Minnesota, they haven't looked that great in the respawns. Obviously, they've kept them a lot closer than maybe some of the other teams have in their respawns, but they're still 0 and 5 in it for a reason. Um, and so I'm gonna give it to Minnesota in the end, but I'm gonna say it's a 3-2. I'm pretty confident Minnesota will take this over New York since they have been incredibly good at SND so far, and maybe they drop an SND, but maybe they pick up a hard point. So I am pretty comfortable in saying Minnesota is going to win this over New York, but I'll give New York the benefit of the doubt here, and I'll say it will go to a game 5 in the end. So those are my predictions for week 2, stage 1 of the CDL 2021 season. Unfortunately, we didn't get Kevin back in here. We'll have to check, make sure we can shovel him out of whatever snow fort he's found him buried in. But I don't really have anything to say. I don't have too much else to add. So I think that's going to be a very short and quick episode for this week. We'll make up for it for next week's episode. We'll have Kevin back in here, hopefully, unless he's become Jack Frost and he melted away. But that that'll be it. I'm sorry, guys, you didn't. I guess maybe you're happy you didn't have as long of an episode, but I'm gonna stop talking for now. I'll let you have the rest of your day. Challengers, Elite Series, be sure to watch it tonight, Wednesday, and then obviously CDL is going to be on Thursday, but since none of the Thursday matchups are all that interesting, you might want to tune into the Westar versus the New York Subliners Academy match that will be happening on Challengers Elite. I'll try to find some links for that to put in the description. But that is it for me. I hope you all have a wonderful week. We'll see you in a week's time to obviously recap week 2 and then give our predictions for week 3. That is it. I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and I will see you next time.